Welcome to this GDI and Geography seminar. My name is Tom Gillespie and I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, Claire Mercer. So Claire is Professor of Human Geography at the LSE. She's a leading thinker on social, economic and urban development in Africa. And she's published on topics including civil society, diaspora, housing and urban development and the middle classes. Claire is currently leading a ESRC funded project on homegrown growth in African cities, which looks at the relationship between self-built housing and economic development in Ghana and Tanzania. And Claire is also the author of this new book, The Suburban Frontier, Middle Class Construction in Dar es Salaam, which is out now and available in all good bookshops.
And free to download.
And free to download, yeah. So you've got no excuse not to read it.
Yes.
From cover to cover. And this is going to be the topic of today's talk. So join me in welcoming Claire to Manchester.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thank you to the GDI and to Geography for inviting me to come and talk this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here, and as Tom said, I want to talk about this book that's just been published called The Suburban Frontier, Middle Class Construction in Dar es Salaam. And I'm going to begin with this image because, which is on the cover of the book, because it captures both the spectacular and the very ordinary nature of what has unfolded on Dar es Salaam's northern periphery over the last 2 decades. So it's spectacular because just 2 decades ago, the land on which these houses were built was pretty much farmland, kind of extensive scrub, cashew and coconut trees, maybe a few small buildings that people were using as bases for farming, but not this kind of built landscape of houses. And it was a landscape that was populated by the Zaramo, who are the indigenous group in Dar es Salaam, various farms of different sizes, and there was a cement factory and some abandoned sisal plantations. And then just 2 decades later, you've had this transformation of this hinterland into these low-density, what people see as desirable residential neighbourhoods. It was well underway by the middle of the 2010s when I first stumbled into this part of Dar es Salaam. But it's also ordinary. It's a kind of middle-class suburban life that seems to embody a global suburban ideal. It's close enough to benefit from the city's economy and social life, but it's far enough to have your space to grow your family, to have a little bit of land. But these neighbourhoods are also distinctive in significant ways, and perhaps most importantly, they're being developed through the repetition of thousands of individual cash-based domestic building projects. They're not being developed through large-scale financialised property development. So this is a suburban zone that's mostly lacking in tarmac roads, as you can see, bulk drainage, sanitation, piped water. They are in fact mostly informal settlements, but not informal settlements as are commonly represented in African cities. Many residents in these areas lack formal legal title to the land that they occupy, but as you can see, this hasn't stopped them from investing in the property that they've constructed themselves. And over the last 2 decades, people in Dar es Salaam have increasingly congregated and transformed this city periphery. So when I first encountered these neighbourhoods in 2012, where I had previously known a rural landscape from when I first arrived in Dar es Salaam in 1996, I was kind of fascinated, who was building in this part of Dar es Salaam, in the northern part? What kind of space was being constructed here? What does this mass self-building on the city's former peri-urban edge tell us about how African cities are changing? So this map shows you where I've been doing my fieldwork up in Salaam, about 25 kilometres to the north of the city centre. And the book addresses those questions that I just laid out to you. It examines the transformation of this northern periphery from the late 19th century, when it was a rural hinterland, through to being a peri-urban fringe, to being a suburban frontier. And it does so through the experience of this one neighbourhood, Salaam, that I will be talking about, and where I've conducted qualitative and ethnographic fieldwork with house builders and residents and government officials on multiple research trips between 2012 and 2018. Starting in the last third of the 19th century, the land farmed by the indigenous group, the Zaramo, was enclosed, it was alienated, it was later nationalised and enclosed again, and eventually, more recently, commodified. It's been claimed by Arab and European investors, then the colonial and post-colonial governments, and then farmers and urban residents. So by the early 2000s, most remaining Zaramo had been dispossessed through hundreds of these individual informal market transactions, people buying these plots in order to build on them. And so in their place, you've got this mosaic of a constructed landscape, and I'm going to be talking about the middle class, but I want to say from the outset this is not an exclusively middle class space, and the book thinks through and talks about why that might be. You do have the urban poor, you have the lower and the middle class, the lower middle classes and the upper middle classes. You have some elite all living in this area. But there's more to the story than just a story about changing land use on the urban periphery, and as I've already suggested, I want to focus in on the middle class. So the central aim of the book is to examine the frontier, the suburban frontier, as the place where Africa's middle classes are being shaped. And I draw on the long tradition in geography of socio-spatial dialectical thinking. I argue that Dar es Salaam's middle classes are building distinctive suburban landscapes, and that those landscapes in turn shape what middle classness is, what it means to be middle class in this particular place. So the suburb isn't a kind of backdrop to an ethnography of the middle class, and I'm also not imagining the suburb as a kind of linear, universal step on a trajectory of urban development. Rather, I'm thinking with socio-spatial dialectics that enables me to see space and society as dynamically co-constituted. They're making each other. So, in a way, I'm spatialising our understanding of the dynamics of middle-class formation. And I'm showing how investment in property, which in the book includes land, houses and landscapes, how those investments are central to middle-class formation and urban futures in Africa. And indeed, with Africa's urban population projected to grow substantially over the next 2 decades and beyond, it is most likely that the majority of extension will happen beyond the central cities. Dar es Salaam is a city that currently has a population of just over 6 million inhabitants. It's projected to grow to over 10 million by 2030 and to become one of Africa's 5 mega cities. And so here we can see that that process is very much underway as people are building homes, businesses on their plots, investing in farming plots both here and beyond the city. You can kind of see this process in motion, and if you like, the book is a kind of snapshot of what's happening at this particular moment in time. So what I want to do in the time that I have is to outline 3 key arguments from the book, and then I want to turn to just one of the chapters about land to try and show you a little bit more where the arguments are coming from. So these are the three arguments that are central to the book. So the first is this idea of the suburban frontier. And the book develops this concept as a way of understanding these important dynamics of contemporary urbanisation in Africa. So I'm using the suburban frontier to capture the urban periphery as a dynamic zone of domestic investment in residential property. And the book traces the formation of the suburban frontier in Dar es Salaam in some detail. So very briefly, the first 2 chapters of the book try and explain how we got to where we did at the start of the 21st century. The suburban frontier emerged where you can see the little kind of peninsula sticking up where it says Oyster Bay. That was the first if you like, suburban frontier, it was built by the British colonial government for Europeans in the 1930s as an exclusive space. But what's interesting about it, and the reason that I think of this as the first suburban frontier, is because you had urban planning, you had investment in homes, you had sanitation, you had large plots on which people could build large houses, which was very different from what existed in the rest of the city. In the late colonial period, the state briefly invested in a small number of housing schemes for Africans, which opened up new suburbs in what are now very densely populated, built inner city neighbourhoods. If you know the city, you'll know of Ilala, Magomeni, Temeke, and Kinondoni. And in the late colonial period, these housing schemes were open to salaried government workers who could live in improved conditions with formal, secure tenure. So by the eve of independence in 1961, you had a state-built suburban frontier that was characterised by better quality housing, planned layouts, and was beginning to emerge in this kind of arc from Oyster Bay round to the west of the city. In the 70s and 80s, the suburban frontier became pushed outwards as the independent government decided to invest in a limited number of housing schemes. You've got the K, the S, and the MK on the map, Sinza, Kijitonyama, Mikocheni, which were sites and services schemes. And what's significant about these is that, again, not only were they planned layouts, but they offered the security of tenure in parts of the city that were ostensibly rural land, and therefore tenure was customary, so people didn't have formal or secure tenure in the city. So we have the sites and services schemes at the same time beyond the city, so in the kind of blank space of the map here, because this map is from 1984, the peri-urban and the rural areas of the city, where rural customary rights of tenure persist, is what is now the suburban frontier that I'm writing about. And it was a period of imperceptible but really important change, because after independence and the shift to socialism, heralded by the Arusha Declaration in 1967, a lot of this area had plantations, sisal estates, privately enclosed land that had been owned by the colonial government or colonial officials, and that was nationalised. And then very soon after that, you had the villagisation scheme. And the Zaramo farmers who had small kind of farms, shifting cultivation in this area, were removed from their lands and corralled into Ujamaa villages. So there's one on the map that is kind of just to the east of Salasala, which is called Mtongani, which was an Ujamaa village in this part of the city. So you have farmers being forcibly removed into collective villages, which leaves literally this kind of blank open space. And in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Tanzanian economy was really struggling, and there was kind of concern about food production. And so the government was telling people in the city, go and farm in the city's peri-urban edges. So people that I've met and talked to who've built in the last 10 years or so have had their land as farms from the 1970s and the 1980s, because they were encouraged to go out to the peri-urban edge to farm in order to produce food for the city. So you have all of these dynamics pushing the suburban frontier outwards over time, over a long period of time. By the time you get to the 1990s, when you have economic liberalisation, population growth, there was also a resettlement scheme that was developed in Salasala, where you can see the word written on this map here. And all of that was driving the desirability of land in this part of the city. And so increasingly people were looking for a piece of land to build on, to invest whatever income they might have, and the suburban frontier becomes the place that people want to acquire land and want to build on. So Given that context, I developed this concept of the suburban frontier as a zone of commodification, of dispossession, of accumulation, of risk, of aspiration and experimentation. And I argue in the book that all of these things going on at the same time is especially productive for middle class formation. So the middle classes have been the principal beneficiaries of the commodification of land and the enclosure of plots on the suburban frontier. And they've been accumulating assets in the form of land that can be built on, can be loaned, or it can be sold, and houses that can be lived in or rented out. But their property is also at risk in this kind of suburban grey zone where the statutory land tenure of the city blends into this customary land tenure that prevails in this formerly rural hinterland. So middle class experience on the suburban frontier is shaped by the twin possibilities for accumulation and loss. Property is always open to contestation from neighbours or from strangers, or reclamation by the state under eminent domain. And so house building is both a sign of middle class formation, but it's an unstable one. And that's why these people are in the middle. It's part of the argument that I want to make. The suburban frontier is also a zone of aspiration, where the middle classes seek to consolidate their social position through the aesthetic value of the architecture and the landscapes that they've created. So in building what people see as desirable residential space that's pushed into the city's formal rural hinterland, the middle classes have transformed this landscape from these scattered farms and uncultivated vegetation into this kind of sea of small-scale, self-built homes on individual plots. And the relative size and the quality and the lower densities of these buildings, together with the attention paid to architectural design and the use of new building materials, has produced what residents consider to be a desirable suburban landscape when compared with the congested inner city neighbourhoods and the scattered or poorer quality housing of the peri-urban fringe that lies beyond the suburban frontier. And finally, the suburban frontier is also a social and cultural frontier, where the new middle classes are pioneering suburban lifestyles built around new consumption practices, English medium schools, new privatised spaces of consumption and private halls where you can hold your wedding or your child's birthday party. So by way of the private car, people can do their supermarket shopping, you can take your kids to school, you can visit family, you can go to church, you can celebrate your weddings without actually having to enter the city's historic urban core. So for the middle classes, life is increasingly lived on the suburban frontier. So that takes me to the second key argument of the book, which is about middle class properties. And so the second contribution that the book makes is to flesh out an approach to analysing middle class formation in Africa as a process of property accumulation. So existing work on Africa's middle classes has highlighted education and formal employment as significant factors that have shaped the middle class over time on the African continent. And in the book I insist that we need to add property to these conditions of possibility of middle class formation, to use Rachel Spronk's term. So property, understood as land, houses and landscapes, slowly accretes into economic and cultural capital that's passed on within families. So this approach is retaining the understanding from Marx that class is a social relation that arises from the social dynamics of unequal ownership of capital and property, but it also recognises with Weber and later with Bourdieu that unequal class relations are also reproduced through culture. So in the book, cultural capital is explored through the aesthetic power of domestic architecture, the suburban landscape, and the lifestyles that people are leading. In addition, the focus is on class formation, following E.P. Thompson's insistence in The Making of the English Working Class that class is neither a structure nor a category, but, as he said, and I quote, something which in fact happens and can be shown to have happened in human relationships, And so the book examines how this process is spatialised through the dialectical formation of the middle class and the suburban frontier. But of course, Marx, Weber, Bourdieu and Thompson were all theorising the dynamics of European societies in historical conditions very different from those that have structured African societies and economies. And so I've turned to work from anthropologists over the last 15 years or so, writing about what's been termed the global middle classes and developing a practice approach to understanding class. And this pays attention to broader political economic structures, but is also concerned with the everyday repetition of actions that form the basis of social classes and the relations between them. And I find the focus on practices is really useful in the context of Tanzania, where the middle classes are unmarked in the vernacular, but the lack of a collective noun for the middling types doesn't mean that they don't exist in practice. And so social classes are shaped by the things that people do, perhaps unconsciously, in the course of their everyday lives. And so in the book, I pay attention to the dispersed yet repeated practices related to property on the suburban frontier, how people acquire, secure and develop plots of land, how they slowly build a house over time, how they decorate their homes, how they represent the landscape to each other and to themselves, how they plan for the future, how they spend their leisure time. So land acquisition and landscape formation, house building and lifestyle are distinctive repertoires of property practice through which middle classness emerges on the suburban frontier. The final key argument of the book is about the coloniality of space. And this is a way of thinking about how the legacies of colonial urban planning linger in the built environment and the visceral experience of the city's landscapes in the past and the present. So, colonial urban planning, however patchy and incomplete, enframed African cities. It left its imprint not only on the city's material form, but also on how people thought about urban space and their place in it. And in the book, I developed the idea of enframing using Timothy Mitchell's work on British colonial power in Egypt. Mitchell himself draws on Said's Orientalism, and his key argument is to show that the effect of colonial enframing serves both to separate and to mutually constitute colonised and coloniser. The effects of the enframing of colonial urban space on the colonised has been powerfully conveyed in the writings of Frantz Fanon and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. From the perspective of the colonised, the colonial city was experienced as a space of physical and psychological violence. So for Fanon, the coloniser's space was seen from the outside as a space of order, of modernity, of comfort, as evidenced by the quality of buildings, the provision of streetlights, permanent roads, so the built environment. And Fanon observes, and I quote, "The streets of his town, the coloniser's town, are clean and even with no holes or stones." And he describes what he calls the native town as the negative opposite of the coloniser's space. It's characterised by congestion. And in Fanon's rendering of colonial urban space, the landscapes of the coloniser and the colonised were built and imagined and experienced as separate compartments of the colonial city. Writing about post-colonial Kenya 2 decades later, Ngugi wa Thiong'o insisted that the traces of colonialism remained scattered across contemporary African cultures and landscapes, what he termed, quote, the mental universe of the colonised. In the work of both Ngugi and Fanon, colonial alienation didn't just entail the reordering of material space, but also a psychological struggle in and for the spaces of cultural production in the post-colony, such as the community centre, the theatre, the university, the hospital, the street. So the coloniality of space emerges from the insistence that colonial and post-colonial worlds have been shaped not just by the exertion of colonial power over the material landscape, but also by the less visible but no less devastating spatial and psychological effects of that power. And those effects continue to shape how people think about and experience the landscapes that have been produced since. So today the coloniality of space is not the only logic of production of urban space, but it remains as a spatial residue of what decolonial scholars identify as the coloniality of power. And so it endures in colonial land tenure regimes that render the majority of urban residents as squatters without access to decent housing or land rights. It endures in residents' ideas about the aesthetics of good urban space, what people think is a desirable urban landscape, looking at topography, planning and architecture. It endures in a hierarchical way of thinking about urban space, in which some people are better than others and people higher up the social hierarchy deserve to live in better places. And as I show in the book, it's also central to middle-class urban imaginaries and spatial practices. So, as I said at the beginning, the start of the book tries to lay out this kind of historical development of the city in order to understand what's happening in Salaam today in more detail in the more empirical section of the book. So there are 4 chapters, of which I'm not going to talk about one of them, obviously, you'll be glad to know. So there's a chapter about land, there's a chapter on landscape in which I flesh out the coloniality of space in more detail. There's a chapter on house building, looking at domestic architecture, and finally there's a chapter on lifestyle. But I'm going to focus in the time I've got left just on land, because I thought that might be of most interest to some of the people here. I know it's something that the African Cities Consortium is looking at. Okay, so I'm sitting with my friend Rajabu in the garden of his home. It's a 2-storey building. It's not one of these in the picture, but it's very similar. It's painted pink. He's got a beautiful landscape garden, a very large house, and we're kind of admiring the trees and the flowers that his wife has planted. And he says to me, you know, people want to buy this land, but I tell my children they must value this land. When I'm gone, they mustn't sell it. There's no better money than land. And Rajabu's insight is really key to understanding middle-class practice around land on the suburban frontier. Not only had they built a house, they built 2 houses in fact. His wife had come to acquire land in the 1970s after the nationalisations and after villagisation, and originally their land, which was large, it was several acres, they used it for cattle, so they weren't living there in the 1970s or the 1980s. At the time, Rajabu was working, he was a civil servant living in government quarters in the city centre. But in the 1990s, they decided to build a small house on their land, and then the house that we were sitting outside having our conversation was the second house that they built, and one of their children was living in the first house. They'd also, on their land, built what's called frames, so these kind of rooms for rent for businesses that are usually located along roads and streets. So they'd built houses, they'd built frames, and they're a kind of very, they're a good example of a common characteristic of middle-class practice, which is over several decades to acquire land at every opportunity, because land enables you to invest earnings, to secure future income streams. For example, if you build something that can be rented or hired by somebody, but it can also project your social status and ensure social reproduction, and these things overlap. So if you buy land with cash, that acts as a form of saving as well as providing a basis for house building, for social status and inheritance. Because for many people, mortgage financing is not an available option, or it is available, but it's not viable. It's not financially possible. So you put your money in land and you build incrementally over time, and that becomes not just a home, but it's also an asset, a financial asset, but in an informal sense, if you like. And I think I've just turned it off. And many people that I spoke to had not just bought land and built houses, but they'd invested in the suburban environment. They built frames, they built businesses such as hair salons, nail salons, bars, livestock feed shops. People were buying additional plots, either in the neighbourhood or beyond it, kind of anticipating where the suburban frontier would be in 10 years' time. People were buying farmland in the neighbouring rural districts adjacent to Dar es Salaam and were farming and selling that material back in Dar es Salaam. Or people were building houses for rental or flats or some kind of businesses on land that they'd acquired either in the city, outside of the city, or perhaps if they'd worked somewhere else or they had land that they'd inherited in other parts of the country. So land then is the most valuable material asset for middle-class suburban residents, and a considerable amount of effort went into scoping, acquiring, enclosing, securing and exclusively using it, as I explore in the book in more detail, and I want to outline some of that here. But I want to just kind of remind us at this point what I said at the beginning, that this is not a homogeneous landscape, it is very mixed. So you have these large houses and kind of these enclosed walls, but you also have next to them smaller houses, people who built and are unable to put up walls, people who built close to what's called hazardous land in planning speak, so here underneath these electricity pylons. And the point is that, you know, not everybody who acquired land in the 1970s is now middle class. There are people that I spoke to who didn't invest in their land, who actually chose to subdivide it and sell it off. And so you have people who have been here since the 1970s, but who don't have the same story as Rajabu that I started out with, but who have very much smaller plots and who have sold their land to people who've come and built around them. Okay, so the first thing to think about is risky transactions, about actually how do you actually acquire land. And as I said earlier on, the land tenure in places like Salaam is what's called quasi-customary. So it's not customary in the sense that it's owned, and in order to do anything with the land, you have to have the agreement of the wider social group. It's quasi-customary, which means it's been sold by somebody who had customary tenure, and it's been exchanged for money. And so you can use it as private land, if you like. You can sell it on, you can do whatever you like with it, you can have it inherited without recourse to the wider social group, but you don't have secure title. Okay, unless you get a formal title from the government, which I will talk about a little bit more. So acquiring and holding on to land in Dar es Salaam suburban frontier was something I spent a lot of time talking with about people and trying to learn about. It was a very risky undertaking. It was routine to be duped by brokers. There's a whole class of people who call themselves brokers, who connect buyers and sellers of land. Your neighbours can encroach on your plot. Strangers might invade on land that's not been enclosed, which is why you see all of these concrete walls around plots that people are anticipating building on. Family members can feud over plots, or government agencies can come and demolish unauthorised constructions to accommodate public services or changes in land use. And so risk is literally written on the landscape. As you walk around, there'll be signs that might be written by people who don't want their plot to be sold, or by brokers who are either wanting to sell a plot or not sell a plot, or you'll come across big red X's where the municipal land officers have come round and said that this building is going to be demolished. So this is a very unpredictable environment. But the point is that the middle classes are much better placed than others to secure their land by drawing on connections to strategically useful individuals, but also because of their learned practices of how to manage assets, dealing with government bureaucracy, not least because actually many of them are part of the bureaucracy. So I'm sure many of you will know Walbard Kombe, Professor of Land and Housing in Tanzania, and he's noted when it comes to controlling land in Dar es Salaam, I quote, "One has to know how and who," and he is absolutely right. So in the interest of time, I'll kind of skip over some of the details, and I want to just talk a little bit about how you get title. Because when I first started doing this work in 2012, I spent quite a lot of time trying to find a map. Obviously, I'm a geographer, so I want to be able to kind of see the place where I'm doing my fieldwork. And it was very difficult to get a map of the places where I was doing my fieldwork in Salaam. In the sub-ward office, this was the only map that I came across. This is a map of the resettlement scheme. So the World Bank sponsored a resettlement scheme where they moved people from an inner part of Dar es Salaam out to Salaam in the late the late 2000s. And so they put this kind of planned area. So if you go into the sub-ward office, that was the only part of the neighbourhood that you could see. The rest of it, there was no map. And the image on the left is when I went to the municipality to ask for the maps, and this is the guy in the planning office kind of trying to go through and find the maps for me. We did eventually find the map, but it was from 2004. And it's in the municipality, right? It's not in the sub-ward, where the lower local government workers don't have access to the maps that were drawn with layouts for these areas. And so when they are called to adjudicate on land matters, they literally have no map to know what government planners had anticipated for their areas. So this is a place where there's improvisation around how to administer land, and there's a kind of lack of mapping and a cadaster. In this context, then, if you're trying to transact and hold on to land, the artefacts of plots and of buildings are not to be trusted. You can't assume that because somebody's placed a concrete pillar, that does actually mark the boundary of something that they've claimed. Plots could be moved, survey beacons could be moved. One neighbour might move another's beacon to increase the size of their plot. A plot may not really be for sale, it might be sold multiple times. You've got this absence of maps and the land cadaster. Neighbours that you might try and talk to ascertain boundaries or who is the real owner of a plot to be sold might indeed themselves be real or fake. Documents and signatures and certificates are routinely fabricated. For example, in this sub-ward, there was a copy of the official stamp of the sub-ward available for use at the photocopy shop opposite the office. And one surveyor described the widespread practice of kupika data, which means to cook data. He says, where you have a title and the survey, but when you check the beacons and the GPS, you find that the plot should be somewhere else. So land is very difficult to pin down. And so I decided to spend some time in the ward tribunal trying to understand what people do when they are faced with these problems of securing your land. And this is an image of the ward tribunal. It's the office door on the right, and I spent a couple of days in the ward tribunal in 2016 listening to people contesting land. The ward tribunal is the lowest level of tribunal that you can access, and it was brought in with local government reform in the mid-1980s. You don't have professional lawyers, it's relatively cheap to use, but you put your case to a group of elders who draw on kind of just practices and ideas and agreements amongst themselves. And so one of the cases that I heard sitting in the ward tribunal were mostly about land. Some of them were also about marriage, but they were mostly about land. And there were kind of fascinating insights into the lengths to which people would go to be able to secure their plots. So, for example, there was a really fascinating case that I sat through where two women who actually didn't live on the plots in Salaam, they lived somewhere else in Dar es Salaam, but they'd ended up with buying two plots next to each other in Salaam. And one of them was basically accusing the other of having encroached on her plot. And I sat through a hearing of this case. It took nearly 3 hours, and the two women had to put their cases to the elders, and then they had to call witnesses to back up their claims. And we got to witness 6, and witness 6 wasn't there because witness 6 couldn't get the time off work, and so the whole thing was abandoned, and the tribunal said, well, you'll have to come back when witness 6 is available. And what kind of struck me about that was the amount of time and effort and social networks that it is going to take to be able to secure your land in this context. And you know, and it also underscores the fact that you're not always going to be successful, and I think that's where the idea of the middle class comes in, because the elite will also litigate their land, but they're not going to do it in the ward tribunal. They're going to take it through the formal, professionalised court system, which is much more expensive. And the urban poor who are not going to be able to secure their land through this process. So there's something middling here about this kind of attempting to work with the institutions but not always knowing if you're going to be successful. And I mean, I also spoke to people who just said, well, I don't bother with the ward tribunal because those people, I mean, they're not professionals. So some of the cases I heard were dismissed because one of the litigants failed to show up and just sent a letter saying, I'm not coming to the ward tribunal, it's got to go to the lowest level of the professional court system, which is called the District Land and Housing Tribunal. So you can begin to see how there is this kind of repertoire of practices that the middle classes use and draw on to try and secure their property, which is where the chapter goes to next. And really the point here is to just go back to something I said before about land tenure, and not just securing your land against neighbours and encroachers or conmen, but also against the threat of eviction or demolition by government. So this is a government caterpillar arriving in Salaam in order to demolish some structures that were too close to the water pipe that they were replacing from the Ruvu River to feed water to Dar es Salaam. And I spoke to people who had houses demolished who just didn't know that they'd acquired land over the water pipe because there was no beacon close by to notify them. So how do people try and secure their land in this process, apart from using the ward tribunal? A lot of people were trying to get formal title, to get formal recognition to their land. And this was an incredibly long and tedious process in which you have your land surveyed, usually by private surveyors, who produce a layout, and it has to be checked by the municipal planners before it gets sent to the national level Ministry of Land to be checked. And what happens is that you get an offer from the Commissioner for Lands at the national level, which you then accept and pay for in order to get your formal, proper land title. And so it's an incredibly long and complex process. And I spoke to people who'd started and got stuck, or who'd got an offer from the Commissioner of Lands and got stuck, and people who said, well, you know, I've got the offer, but I don't have the money to pay for the actual title, but the offer will kind of do for the moment, and then if I really need to have formal title, then I can get it if I needed it. So it was a case of kind of working with the system to get what you could manage at any particular time. What really struck me was that until 2022, I didn't encounter a single resident in Salaam who had actually privately had their land surveyed and finally got a granted right of occupancy on what had been formerly unplanned land. Apart from one person in 2022, which I will tell you about. Rajabu was one of those who had not got formal title. When I talked to him in 2018, he was trying to get formal title for his land, but the problem was that the maps that the municipality had and the GPS for his house showed that his house had been built on a road, which it actually hadn't. And he said to me, you know, they can't give me a title for a place that's where the road is, so the maps are wrong and they need to redraw them, which of course wasn't going to happen. So he was kind of stuck. Until the government decided to roll out a land regularisation programme. And since the 1990s under President Mkapa, there have been a whole range of programmes to regularise land, starting in rural areas. And then at the end of Kikwete's period and into Magufuli's period, the government decided to kind of ramp up its efforts to regularise, which means giving formal title to people like those that I'm talking about, who are occupying land that does not have formal, secure title. So the book talks a little bit about this programme and why it might have been brought in. And I just want to kind of finish by talking a little bit about what happened with this programme in the place where I was doing field work. So what was different about the regularisation was that neighbourhoods would get surveyed communally together rather than the individual process that I've just described. And because municipalities don't have enough urban planners or surveyors, the government said it should be private surveyors who do this. So what happened was that private surveying companies were going around to neighbourhoods and entering into agreements with neighbourhoods through their sub-ward offices to group survey their land. And the price of this was varied massively between I've got it in Tanzanian shillings, I can't remember off the top of my head, in pounds. So to be part of this process, it might cost you anywhere between, say, £60 and £150. So a lot cheaper compared to if you did it privately. So this is relatively good. But in the places where I was doing field work, these regularisation programmes didn't go smoothly. So in one neighbourhood, there was an area of land that had been zoned for industrial use in the 1979 master plan, and the government was refusing to change the land use from industrial to residential and have that whole place surveyed. So they kind of got stuck in the 1979 master plan. Another part got stuck because there were invaders who'd invaded an old quarry that was supposed to be in the maps that sat in the municipality, that was earmarked for government services, a health centre and a school, but somebody had come and enclosed it and built houses on it. So again, because the reality on the ground didn't match the maps, that neighbourhood had also not been able to make very much progress. Out of the three neighbourhoods where I was doing field work, there was only one that had actually managed to have their land surveyed communally, but they'd also got stuck because out of the 950 households in that neighbourhood who were eligible for the surveying scheme, only 400 of them had actually paid the fee to be part of the surveying programme. And so what's happened since then is that a lot of these surveying companies and these regularisation projects have just kind of got stuck because people haven't paid, there's problems with the land use, and the whole kind of system doesn't seem to be producing very much in the way of titles. Except that when I talked to Rajabu in February of 2022, he had got his title. And he'd got his title because the regularisation project had produced a new map which showed that his house wasn't on the road. And so he had been able to convert his offer, get his title deed, and his title deed, forget about all the surveying, just the title deed cost him $522 US. And so I think what's fascinating about that is that the regularisation drive, on the one hand, it could be potentially radical because you've had this kind of suburban frontier where land tenure is insecure. It does hold out the possibility of recognised rights to land, but it's going to be really difficult for people to do that when you have to pay for it, I think. And Rajabu's experience kind of suggests to me how this might continue to play out in the very near future. Because this regularisation drive is offering a new strategy for the middle classes who've been investing in land, and they've been attempting to shore up their claims by navigating transactions, the district land court, dealing with neighbours and the bureaucracy. But this is giving them this new opportunity to be able to do that. Tom, have I got a couple of minutes just to make a last couple of comments?
Cool.
So I just want to finish with a couple of comments about kind of some of the bigger issues that I think the focus on land in particular throws up. And this is around urban accretion in what I'm thinking of as cities of cash. So cities accrete. Their built form takes shape slowly over time as urban residents and businesses and governments and many others construct them piece by piece. And what I do in the book is I propose a way of thinking of the city as an accretion of land and property that's produced in this dialectical relationship with society and the suburb and the middle classes constructing each other. So as a particular form of urban accretion, the suburban frontier captures one dynamic of contemporary social and spatial change in the post-colonial city, where the majority of urban residents are building their own houses. So what I argue is that we need to look more closely at how urban residents are investing in their cities and beyond to better understand how social class is spatially reproduced in contemporary Africa. So domestic investment on Dar es Salaam's suburban frontier doesn't really match universalised assumptions about what counts as productive property, what counts as value, what counts as surplus. Putting cash into urban property may not actually offer very much in terms of actual capital accumulation. In economies dominated by cash, land and houses are important stores of material and aesthetic value. Urban residents' investments in land and housing drive opportunities for land value capture and urban rents in African cities. And my aim here is to try and demonstrate the social and the spatial significance of the small yet really widely practiced, repeated investments. I focused on the middle classes, but of course it's not just the middle classes. We're investing cash in these cities, mostly operating outside of circuits, global circuits of finance capital, putting their cash directly into urban land and houses. And I'm really inspired here by Jane Geyer and Sarah Berry's work in West Africa, where they've shown how everyday cash transactions and domestic investments in houses, cocoa farms and teak trees reap what Jane Geyer's called marginal gains over time and drive social class formation. Now, I'm not suggesting that African cities and their residents exist outside of global financial circuits. I think that the way in which different financial circuits and systems are interconnected in people's everyday lives would repay further research. Some money that goes into housing comes from remittances, might be sent as cash or through a mobile money app, although it's not really a major contributor to the financial landscape in Dar es Salaam yet. But I think better understanding the dynamics of urban land is key. The land grab literature in Africa has made a welcome urban turn. It's drawn our attention to large-scale investments of elites and international capital in African cities. There's not as much of that in Dar es Salaam as there has been in other cities yet, which isn't to say, of course, it won't happen. But my point is that there's much to learn about how Africa's urban residents themselves are investing in cities, in intermediate towns, in rural areas, in less immediately visible but no less significant ways. I think I'll end it.